Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to the March webinar, and happy St. Patrick's Day. Yay! Hope you're wearing green and don't get pinched. Today is my half birthday, so happy half birthday to me. Yay! Before we start, obviously we need to acknowledge the situation that's going on globally right now with the COVID-19 disease. And glad that those of you who are on were able to join us. And of course, we will have this webinar recorded like we have in the past and make all the materials available. And I hope that everybody is maintaining their sanity. These are difficult times. But at the same time, we also have to go forward with the work that we are able to do. So we're just going to move forward with the webinar and go through with our topics for today, because climate change is not going to be stopped by COVID-19, although wouldn't that be a nice silver lining? But so we need to still talk about our own resilience strategies for that particular disaster. But again, acknowledging that we're all stressed and anxious, and a lot of what we're going to learn throughout this series actually does apply even to these sorts of situations, especially learning to take a deep breath and just be calm. And so do that as much as you need to do. Just take those deep breaths and focus and take care of yourselves and your families first, so that we can keep on doing the important work that we all need to do. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Angie.
All right. Hi, everybody. Just feeling grateful right now that we can continue to connect with you all that are able to. We actually have a pretty good showing today because we have the technology to do webinars. So it's nice to connect with you all remotely. This is our third monthly webinar. So far, if you've been with us, we've established, I think, a good foundation of a basic understanding of how climate change can affect tribal health. And oh, I have to share my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Let me just make sure. All right, Shasta, can you tell me if I'm sharing screen?
Yes, it's just right.
Thank you. Okay, so last time we dove deep on temperature extremes and we talked about wildfire as well. And today we're going to tackle drought, melting ice and sea level rise, and storms and flooding. And so we're lucky today. We have a brief speaker who's going to join us, I believe, from Washington, and we're going to hear about how a tribe is on the front lines of sea level rise and how they're starting to think already about possible relocation. So that'll be a little bit later today. So just a little acknowledgement that I know the topic we're talking about today could add some stress on top of a stressful situation. But I have a feeling that my pep talk is that the folks that are with us on this call, the professionals working with their communities, are the kinds of folks that are amongst the critical helpers and can help keep some calm in times like these. And so the good news is next month in April, we actually have another guest speaker. That's going to be Dr. Douglas Walker. He's an expert on how we can protect our community and build our psychosocial well-being and resilience, both individually and as a community. So I think that'll be good timing. A lot of it has parallels. So if you're like me, you're observing some interesting parallels with climate change, with the events of the coronavirus happening right now. And so I think you'll see some parallels as we even talk today. Just I'm trying to use it to keep in mind some lessons to learn as we prepare for potential future events that have to do with climate change and health. All right. So let's go ahead and do what we always do. Talk a little bit about since the last webinar. I do hope that many of you have
Oops.
Okay, I think Shasta might have muted somebody with some background noise, but we're back.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So if you are in a cohort, if you wanted to be in a cohort and you are in one of the 5 cohort areas that we've selected, you should have received an invitation to a groups.io subgroup for your region, and that email has asked you to take a look at some options for dates that we want to meet. This will be a remote technical assistance meeting. And so that's basically Shasta and I and folks in your region talking amongst each other about issues that are specific to your area and potentially providing resources that are more specific than we can provide on a nationwide basis. And so please take a look at that, respond to the poll about the best date, and then as we move on, continue to use that regional cohort as a group that you can share information, announcements, resources, questions, and try to build some relationships if that's appealing to you, because we find that regions can really help each other and leverage some knowledge, capacity, or more. Maybe can work together on projects. Okay, last time we talked a little bit about suggested action items to complete before this next webinar. So we said, if you could identify which temperature and wildfire related indicators are being tracked for you in your region. And so you're reaching out to potential partners who may be tracking that kind of data. We suggested taking a moment to talk to your elders and consider how wildfire and temperature changes have affected your tribe. And then an activity was to just input into your location into the Climate Explorer to see temperature data and projections for your community. So in the chat discussion down below, if you can add to the question box on the right in your GoToWebinar function, if you can tell us a little bit about if you learned anything from your elders, if you happen to do that task. And then also we're going to talk about the suggested reading. So if you were able to read this a chapter out of the impacts of climate change on human health in the United States, just tell us what chapter appealed to you, what did you read, and why did you choose that particular chapter? And so while we're waiting for any comments, I'll just share with you this diagram on the right. This is coming out of the report that we suggested that you read. And so this is sort of a high-level diagram showing all the various health impacts that study goes over. And that report was written by the United States Global Change Research Program. And it was a special report on climate change and human health. And it was in 2016, but it's probably still the premier document when it comes to climate change and health on a national scale, and did a good job of diving really deeply on each of the topics on the right here. So you can see they categorize it by extreme heat, outdoor air quality, flooding, vector-borne infection, water-related infection, food-related infection, and mental health and well-being. And that that helped us think through how we would structure this training as well. And so this summary here is just a good high-level summary of the drivers, exposures, outcomes, and impacts associated with health of each of those potential exposures. We call those exposures, it's a combination of exposures and secondary exposures in the way that we present it. And so those really reflect the chapters that are in that report. And so if you haven't yet had a chance to look at that report, I mainly want you to know it exists. And each region is affected by these exposures somewhat differently, and they talk somewhat about that in the report. So it's a little region specific. They'll give you some information. But know it exists, and if something's really standing out to you as very important for your region, take a closer look at those chapters. Shasta, are you seeing any comments come in?
No comments yet, but I do want to let people know that at any time you can put those comments or suggestions or questions in that box if you think of something. And I know we're all busy, so it's hard to necessarily go back to these actions and remember to follow through with them. But you can always say, well, if I had, this is what I would have read, or this is the chapter that really speaks the most to me. And really do take a chance if you can to look at that Climate Explorer. I don't have the results right in front of me right now, but the temperature changes that are coming to the Southern California area are really going to be pretty dramatic, and that's really worth looking at to see what's going to affect your community. And now we do have a comment here from Lori Montserrat, and she said that She focused on the vector-borne disease aspect of the report. She's fascinated by the subject. I am too. And she also says the irony has not escaped me. Yes, absolutely. I think we're all going to be looking at that a little bit more in the weeks and months to come.
That's right. That's right. So infectious disease, certainly on everybody's mind. And so you'll learn if you read that chapter about the regions that are being affected more broadly than they had been in the past and the seasonal changes. But we'll talk about that. So the topics we're talking about today, the exposures we're talking about today, do have an impact on vector-borne infection. Okay, any other comments, or should we move on?
No, I think we need to move on.
All right. All right, so you remember our framework. Like I said, we've already covered temperature extremes and wildfire as a primary exposure. Today we're doing storms and flooding, in this order actually: storms and flooding, melting ice and sea level rise, and drought at the end. We will do what we did last time, which is we're going to talk about the exposure itself. We're talking about secondary exposures, the impacts of both of those. We will also a little bit touch on sample strategies and touch on a couple of tribal case studies. And so that's how we'll proceed through these three topics. I do have a poll that I'd like to share at this point. And so let me go ahead and pull that up. So this poll is going to be kind of high level. And I just want to hear from you what your community has experienced so far. So it just says my community has experienced the following, and you can choose more than one. So have you experienced storms and severe storms and flooding, so beyond normal? Melting ice, that would be for folks that are dealing in an icy region. Sea level rise or drought. So for folks that are able to just go ahead and select as many of those that are applicable. We'll keep this open for another 5 seconds or so before we close it off, and then we'll share the results with you.
We've got 70% have, well, 68%, I'll be specific, have voted. So I'm gonna give one last screaming goat warning. All right.
All right. Hey, we got at least a couple more. Cool. Okay. Close this down. And now we'll share the results. Okay. So interesting. 76% of people on the line have experienced severe storms and flooding. 9% have experienced melting ice. 32% have experienced sea level rise, and 62% are experiencing drought. Okay, that's actually, that's really interesting, and also sort of what the research is telling us. So our first topic is going to be severe storms and flooding, which everybody across the country is expected to experience, but it looks different across the country. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So this, just to confirm, we're back on the main screen, right, Shasta?
Yes.
Okay. All right, storms and flooding. So this will be our first exposure we go through today. So first we'll go over the key climate exposure facts. So what the research is telling us, so documents like those that are coming out of the US Global Change Research Project and national level data is showing that severe storms include a variety, it's inclusive of a variety of different types of meteorological activities. So it could be extreme rainfall, extreme snowfall. It could be an upward trend in tropical cyclone activity. So that would include things like the northern Atlantic hurricanes. It also includes more variable thunderstorm events. We say things like variable because it's a complicated intersection of meteorological conditions that presents itself as different forms of storms and flooding. And so we'll talk about this. There's a certain level of uncertainty because there's so many interacting pieces here. but we know that they vary based on other conditions. And so thunderstorms events would include things like wind, hail, and tornadoes. And, we see things like changes in the time of year we can expect these activities. We see tornadoes, potentially happening within a smaller range, but happening in a more extreme, happening more extremely. And so you can see on the right there, that's an image that's depicting hurricane-induced flood effects in the eastern and central United States. That's obviously the region most hit by a hurricane, where we don't see that as much on the western side. And so you can see the flood ratio being higher in certain regions than before. You can also see down below the extreme one-day precipitation events in the contiguous 48 states from 1910 to 2015. And so that's coming from the EPA. And that's just a percent of land area that is hit by an extreme one-day precipitation event. And you can just see that increasing over time since 1910 to almost today. And so that's the intersection we'll talk about today. So the intersection between storms and flooding, which we'll go through now, and then towards the end of today's workshop will be a discussion of drought. So while we see potentially in some areas less precipitation overall, we will be seeing more extreme precipitation events in most of the areas of the United States. And just a hello to Jamie. Thank you for joining us. Jamie, you're going to hear from Jamie a little bit later when we get to melting ice and sea level rise.
And I really hope that when she talks to us, it's accompanied by the guitar that we can see.
Can you sing it? That would be great. Okay, so thank you. All right, so not only do the storms event happen, but they also trigger flood events. So that could be flash floods, prolonged flooding along rivers and streams, and coastal flooding. And so we hear from tribes all the time that they're either located right on a coast or right by a river. And so different kinds of flooding can impact them. It's exacerbated, of course, by sea level rise and earlier snow melt, along with, and we will talk about that in our next section when we talk about melting ice and sea level rise. And it also is impacted by man-made changes to the landscape. And my next slide, I have a little video to kind of, to make that a little bit more real. We have to talk about the context of some earthen changes that have already occurred that has affected tribes and changing flood patterns and things. We know that it also contributes to landslides, mudslides, and erosion. I have worked with tribal communities that do whole erosion studies, because they have either steep terrain or interesting geological conditions and are worried about erosion, landslides, and mudslides. So let me show you this next graph. This is coming from the EPA, which has a really fabulous report that provides projections on a number of climate impacts. And so this would be the number of 100-year floods that is projected in different climate scenarios. So RCP 4.5 just means a different scenario of emissions, a different emissions regime, and 8.5 is a higher scenario of emissions. So in terms of modeling that out into the future, 8.5 would be us living in a future where there's more emissions, and 4.5 is a lesser amount of emissions. Not lesser than today, but lesser than 8.5. So according to those two models, you can see the number of 100-year floods in the contiguous United States rising steadily for the remainder of the century, and about twice as many floods projected under the higher emissions level than the lower emissions level by the end of the century. And so that's just, pointing to a little bit of uncertainty. We don't know exactly how this will play out, but we are looking at different models. But in general, the number of 100-year floods is expected to rise. And who is affected? Like I said, pretty much everybody, but in different ways. And so while we move forward here, again in the question box, if folks on the line could start predicting what health impacts you might anticipate coming from these exposures. And so go ahead
and while we wait for that, we do have a question about which EPA report are these figures sourced from?
I will send that out. That's this was provided to us actually by our, we were originally funded by the EPA, and the people that were our account managers helped to write the National Climate Assessment and also helped to write this report, which is a multimodal framework for climate projections. And we will send the link out for that, but it's basically a compilation of a lot of different data on indicators, data that are projected out into the future, a lot of the times by the end of the century. So you could actually access the data itself, and you can access the narrative about the impacts. And so 100-year floods is just one of very many topics that they go over, ranging from crops to domestic migration. So I find it fascinating. I think it's one of the best reports for modeling out there.
And we have another question about erosion studies from Joseph Owl. What do these studies encompass? Is this general topography assessment of where not to build, stormwater enhancement? Just curious.
Yeah, I'm not an erosion studies specialist, but I use them. I look at them when I'm doing a vulnerability assessment, so they sort of vary. But a lot of times it's diving deeply into this, the science behind the geological conditions and trying to predict to what extent what the trends will be for erosion. And I know that tribes are using it mainly for development purposes, but it also can help them predict and avoid, if possible, impacts to their natural environment as well.
And we're getting some answers on your actual questions. So Cynthia Toop says food issues, water salination, and loss of infrastructure are concerns. Lori Montserrat says increased mosquitoes, disturbance of the salmonids, flushing reds specifically, local disturbance of homes, water quality, increased downstream sediment. And she also says, not sure there is anyone from Jackson Rancheria on the webinar, but just last week they had a crazy heavy rain and local flooding. Unexpected and not an area you think of as flooding, which it's east of Sacramento. Stefan says, increased vector-borne diseases from standing water and mosquitoes, reduced access to emergency services due to impacted infrastructure, physical injury, flooded agricultural fields causing reduced food availability. And another one from Lori, increase of impermeable cover will additionally increase runoff. And by impermeable cover, that's things like roads, concrete surfaces, sidewalks, parking lots, that kind of thing.
Well, you guys covered it. We're done. No, but that was you guys are well, very familiar, it seems, with the impacts of storms and flooding. So obviously storms and flooding isn't new. We're talking about how to prepare for this increased trend where things get more severe. I do want to show this. I'm gonna have to get out of here for just a second and share this with you. This is a video. It's going to just bring home some experiences that tribes are having in one part of the country, and then an expert going to talk a little bit about some of the tribal context around storms and flooding.
I'm Amy Goodman. While the Southern Hemisphere faces its worst tropical cyclone on record, democracynow.org,
Excuse me.
recover from unprecedented flooding this week that devastated communities in Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, and particularly Nebraska. Warming temperatures, snowmelt, and heavy rainfall led to a flash flood that overwhelmed the Missouri River. The rising waters breached levees, killing at least 4 people, destroying or damaging thousands of homes. Much of the news about the flooding has focused its impact on farmers, but the climate change-fueled weather has also hit Native American communities hard, with 4 tribal nations in Nebraska declaring a state of emergency. This is Larry Wright Jr., chair of the Ponca tribe of Nebraska, speaking last week.
Today, I've declared a state of emergency for the Ponca tribe of Nebraska in our territory as it relates to our homeland in Niobrara, as well as our communities in Norfolk and Sioux City. And we'll continue to monitor the situation as we move forward. With the flooding.
Scientists warn that more flooding is on the way as a climate change fueled extreme weather patterns around the planet.
I'm going to skip ahead to an academic talking about tribal history.
Climate change. In his new book, Our History is the Future, Nick Estes tracks how 2 centuries of indigenous resistance created the movement at Standing Rock proclaiming water is life. Estes is assistant professor of American Studies at University of New Mexico, co-founder of the indigenous resistance group, the Red Nation. He is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. Professor Estes, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you respond to what's happened in the Midwest from Nebraska on, and particularly talk about the effects on Native Americans?
Right, so this history of flooding actually goes back to the 1930s when the Missouri River flooded a lot of towns downriver, and the United States government, under the auspices of the Green Deal, or the New Deal, proposed a series of earthen-rolled dams on the main stem of the river to prevent flooding downriver in places like Kansas that are experiencing flooding right now. And so in places like Lower Brule, where I'm from, they built the Big Bend Dam, and then upriver from there, they built the Oahe Dam to have sort of flood control for downriver states. And so what we're seeing right now is just a continuation of the mismanagement of that river and the flooding that's being caused specifically by the Army Corps of Engineers. These dams dislocated and forcefully removed about 1/3 of our river reservation populations, including my own community. In places like Fort Berthold, about 80% of the tribal population was removed. And so what we're experiencing right now is a continuation of the legacy of the Pink Sloan dams that were built to prevent this kind of disaster. And so in many ways, we have a compounding of issues with the unusual weather cycles, the torrential rain, and then couple that with the fact that the government shut down for 35 days, preventing a lot of tribal communities that are now affected by this flood from getting heating assistance during the winter time. And so it's a combination of things that are at work here. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that while it is related to climate change in the present, it's also related to the altering of the environment, and specifically the annihilation of the river ecosystem to provide sort of flood control in the first place.
Okay. We're not going to spend too much time focused on that conversation, but I think a lot of you could potentially relate to it. I know that I work with one community that, and this is not uncommon, that a highway was built right through their reservation, and they experienced the flood changes as a result of that infrastructure decision having been made without their consent. And so they are constantly seeing runoff coming off of that highway that is impacting them when a severe storm happens. So I'm sure you have some of your own experiences, but just be thinking through, obviously flooding is not a new issue. There have been attempts to mitigate it in different ways, and those have their own impacts as well. Okay. I do have one more poll here I'd like to share, just to get a little bit more deep into your experience of severe storm events. And so I'm going to launch this. Okay, so it says, what kind of severe storm events are you experiencing within your community? And so you can pick all that apply here. So you can pick extreme rainfall events or monsoons. You can choose extreme snowfall events, hurricanes and tropical storms, tornadoes, and then one, you can, below, if you don't have severe storms, then you can select that option.
And we're up to 45%. Here's our screaming goat alarm.
Let's give it a few more seconds. We're just looking to get a sampling just to see what you all are dealing with out there. All right, let's give it 3, 2, and 1. All right, closed and shared. So most of you, it looks like, are dealing with extreme rainfall events or monsoons. 9% are dealing with extreme snowfall events. Nobody on the line is dealing with hurricanes and tropical storms. 6% are dealing with tornadoes, and 9% say they do not have severe storms. And I'd be interested if any of those folks want to put in the chat box or the question box where you live, that you're not experiencing severe storms. That would be informative. Okay, so get back to our main screen here. We're going to dive into some impacts. So these impacts might be, some of them relatively obvious that you would anticipate, and some of you have already said them. There's obviously the risk of storm and flooding related injury and death. So floods are actually one of the deadliest weather-related hazards in the United States. It's second only to heat in terms of numbers. The chart on the right there comes from the CDC, National Environmental Public Health Tracking Network, which has a tremendous amount of interesting data. And this is, it's not always as recent as we'd like, but this is 2011. You can see across the nation where the high populations of people within a FEMA designated flood hazard area exist. So you get a little bit of an idea. The darker the color, the more of an at-risk area you may be in. And so that's one way to look for vulnerabilities, to figure out how many people might be in a flood hazard area. In the United States, inland flooding caused over 4,500 deaths between 1959 and 2005. And so, like we said, the impacts of the flooding are also compounded by development in the floodplain and different land use changes. And so people in flood-prone areas are at increased risk. Another impact is on mental health. And so, in this training, we take that as a serious health impact. And it would include things like post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, and grief. And when it comes to flooding, those impacts are associated not just with the direct event itself during the storm or during the flood, but could have longer-term losses, including social impacts, stress, and economic hardship for as long as the recovery period is. And so in some communities, that could be a year or more where the recovery is still sort of active. And so this is actually interesting. On the right, it comes from the American Psychological Association. This is what happens when people experience a disaster or traumatic event. And so it's just giving high level an idea of what we can expect our community to be experiencing. And so it includes feelings becoming more intense and sometimes unpredictable. Thoughts and behavior patterns are affected. Recurring emotional reactions are common. Interpersonal relationships can become strained, particularly if you're living in temporary housing. So there are instances where a storm may actually force relocations. And physical symptoms may accompany extreme stress. So we know that there is a connection between stress and actual physical symptoms. Like I said, next month, we'll talk a little bit more about some strategies around how to handle some of these impacts. And this might be a little lesser considered impact, but one that definitely has parallels to what we're thinking about today. So the damage, in this case, if we have storm and flood damage to infrastructure, it can limit access to health services in a variety of different ways. And so that can cause health impacts through not being able to access health services. It could also result in illness and carbon monoxide poisoning. So let's go through some of the possibilities here. One could be, like we talked about with temperature extremes, heat waves can often be associated with brownouts and power outages. When it comes to infrastructure being affected, we may see power outages associated with storms and flooding. We also could see road closures. I see this with many of the tribes I work with who don't have as redundant of transportation routes as maybe some other communities do. Maybe there's one road in and out. If that gets damaged, then folks may find themselves in a position where they are trapped or supplies cannot get in and out. Damaged health and emergency facilities, so your hospitals, your clinics, your emergencies can overwhelm health and emergency systems. So that's where I see the parallel with what we're dealing with right now. But this is an article on that topic on the upper right. It's just talking about how hurricanes and other disasters affect hospital care. And it's just talking about how these kinds of disasters can overwhelm busy hospitals, for days after a storm dissipates. And so it could leave patients without resources. It could lead to not enough capacity. And so there's something called hospital surge or capacity surge that hospitals often have a preparation plan for, some sort of emergency management plan for, that they can increase capacity. So if you're in a community where you have a hospital locally that you rely upon, which is everybody, if you have some kind of relationship, you'd at least want to check in and find out what their hospital surge capacity plan would be. Do they have a resilience plan to keep in business if things go a little berserk for some kind of a natural event like this? And then also to think through, it can also lead this, infrastructure damages could also affect schools and businesses, and that could lead to closures and economic damages.
And on that note, we had a comment a little while back from Nicholas Briscato answering your question, and he brings those things up. There can be issues of access to basic health services because of road washouts, flooded roadways, access to dialysis centers, pharmacies, hospitals, and even leaving elder housing for these services, that access could be cut off.
That's right. That's right. And I think we talked about medically dependent folks as well under temperature extremes. So same thing here. Folks that need access to dialysis, ventilators, those kinds of things during a power outage would be at risk here. Okay, so that's some of the impacts of the direct exposure of storms and flooding. Let's think through the secondary exposures now. So you can expect storms and flooding to trigger the following secondary exposures. So we're going to talk a little bit about air quality, vector-borne illness, water insecurity, and food insecurity. And so the air quality impacts would include indoor mold. I think somebody already potentially brought that up. We'll talk a little bit more about the impact of that. Mosquitoes, so the prevalence of mosquitoes as we see more stagnating water in the aftermath of a severe storm where there's flood water that stays stagnant. Water contamination and supply disruption, and food contamination and supply disruption. And the chart there on the right, the diagram or the image there is kind of showing the cycle of precipitation and how it can lead to additional runoff into the waterways, contaminating, adding nutrients, nitrates, and other organic material, as well as toxins into the waterways. And for tribes, water contamination can be a very serious issue because you're usually operating your own domestic supply of groundwater, and so could be severely vulnerable to water contamination, and that has health impacts as well. And we'll talk through those. So some of the illness, illness associated with mold exposure. All I'm doing here is showing you a flood projection, or a flood trend map. So this is a change in the magnitude of river flooding in the United States, and so you can see where it either is expected to increase or decrease. This is coming from the EPA, and so I know a lot of tribes are, they try to predict their flood vulnerability based on their riverline flooding. And there are communities that I've worked with who have actually had their schools inundated by flood water and have dealt with mold exposure, and the remediation process has been very expensive. So not only is the health impacts would be to the folks that are residing within a building with mold, so it's indoor air quality in this case, and in some cases they've had to close down those schools temporarily while expensive remediation activities are occurring. And it can lead to respiratory illnesses. We also see, like I said, infections and illness from contaminated water and marine food. So if you're a community that is dependent upon a marine source of food, the contamination will obviously affect those species as well. And drink, so not only would your local supplies be at risk of contamination from the runoff, drinking water and food supply interruption could also occur because of those road closures we talked about. So if you're in a community where you're used to importing in supplies, food or otherwise, you may see some delays in terms of being able to access those things. Somebody mentioned vector-borne disease. The specific ones that we typically look at when it comes to storms and flooding include West Nile virus, Zika, and dengue. Those are the ones that are affected by mosquito-carrying vectors. I'm sorry, disease-carrying mosquitoes. And some of the reasons behind the relationship here with storms and flooding has to do with just the breeding patterns of both hosts and mosquitoes. So in a storm and flood, you obviously are going to be, the mosquitoes are dependent upon hosts, including birds and animal hosts, so like horses, and they can transmit a disease then to the human population. We see a correlation between increased storm levels and flooding with the increased incidence of West Nile virus. And that chart on the bottom left is showing you changes in just a 4-year period between 2010 to 2013, the increase in the distribution of West Nile virus in the United States, where the darker blocks are showing you where West Nile virus has expanded. And then on the right, you see this is a projection that comes again from that EPA multimodal framework of projections. This is showing you the places where West Nile virus is expected to have a relative increase. And so the darker oranges and reds are areas where we are expecting in those two different emission scenarios to see a relative increase in projected West Nile virus cases. West Nile virus we could probably, maybe in our next session, we'll talk a little bit more about how West Nile virus presents itself and the symptoms to look for and things like that. Shasta also has some outreach materials she's provided that talk a little bit about that to educate the community. So storms and flooding in general we have a list of vulnerable populations that we look for when we're doing a vulnerability assessment, just to make sure that those are particularly considered. And so children and elders, partially because they may be less able to, on their own, be able to escape from an emergency situation. They also would be maybe more prone to some of the vector-borne diseases as well, and less able to adapt to a respiratory illness that might come from indoor indoor mold. Residents living in older homes, neighborhoods lacking green space. Green space can absorb more flood water than impervious surfaces, as somebody mentioned. People with physical disabilities, people without health insurance, people susceptible to health impacts from poor air quality, people with existing mental, behavioral, or cognitive disorders, electricity-dependent populations, outdoor workers, transit-dependent populations, because we know there are so many known transportation disruptions, and households in poverty, which is pretty common amongst all of these exposures, that folks without resources have a more difficult time adapting. And then some sample population sensitivity and adaptive capacity factors. These are some of the data that we look for when we're trying to assess risk for this particular exposure in any community. So we'd be looking at data on the 100 and 500-year flood area, hydrological conditions, percent of the area that's covered by an impervious surface, the population of more critical structures within a floodplain, hospitals per 100,000 people, economic hardship or social vulnerability index, and community cohesion. And so these are just, there is data around these things. This is just helping us moderate. We know if severe storms and floods are anticipated by the data when we look at the exposure, then we look at the impacts and we moderate our evaluation of how severe and likely the impacts will be for a community by some of these population sensitivity and adaptive capacity factors. So that basically means if you have a lot of people in the flood area, while your storms might not be as severe as another community, if everybody lives in a floodplain, you would want to consider that maybe a potentially higher vulnerability level. Some other impacts, so not just to physical and mental health, but to socioeconomic and cultural health. Displacement, whether it's temporary or longer term, is an issue, as well as destruction of historical or cultural sites and assets. And one of those communities that had a highway built through it, that the runoff seeps down into its community. Its main landmark for celebrations was a lake that has been inundated by so much contaminants from the highway that has grown over with vegetation and is no longer usable. So that's just one example of how cultural sites may be affected, but of course they could be affected directly by a flood. And so I have a question for you down here. If you want to throw something in the question box, just in your own experience, how might cultural well-being and traditional ways of life be disrupted by storms and flooding? So if you have any experiences there, please feel free to share. We also think through lost school days and business revenues. In the event, say, one of the major industries for a community is affected. So somebody mentioned agriculture. That's certainly true. A scouring of the crop fields could potentially lead to a not just a food insecurity issue, but also a revenue issue and an economic hardship. The same could be true if a flood affects maybe some hospitality or other major source of income. And then, of course, economic damage. So we see a lot of economic damages, particularly in fishing communities where the contamination may have affected their fishing supplies. And also, you know, there's a way to calculate. You can look at past events and look at the response and recovery costs to try to predict how much economic damage you'd want to be prepared for or avoid by doing certain mitigation measures.
So we're getting some good responses here. 7 says not being able to continue home patterns, celebrations, and traditions, and being separated from friends and family within the normal community. Natalie talks about the destruction of the wild rice harvest, and yeah, I've heard that one before. Levi Anderson, destruction of culturally important resources and sites. And Cynthia Toop says cultural events being canceled. Absolutely.
Yes.
Oh, here's another one. On some of the tribal nations in northern Minnesota, and this is from Michelle Shaw, the mosquitoes are so bad that if you are outside, you need to get inside really quick so that the mosquitoes don't follow you inside. So I'm worried that people won't be able to be outside. Michelle, that sounds horrifying. And we have mosquitoes in San Diego, but not like that.
Yeah, actually, yeah. This last year during the summer, I lived through a EEE outbreak in Connecticut, where the whole northeastern area was sort of locking down on dusk and dawn, where the mosquitoes were out because people were dying of an encephalitis that was transmitted from horses. That's not a climate change issue, but I just relating to the fear of mosquitoes is very real and could drive you indoors for long periods of time. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about strategies in just a minute here. Let's touch quickly on natural environment impacts of storms and flooding. So this course is not on natural environment necessarily. We're focused more on health, but the disruptions associated with storm and flooding include declines and stresses to habitats, waterways, and important sensitive plant and wildlife species. So that can include loss of vegetation, erosion, runoff, fish mortality, and then built environment impacts would include damage to homes and businesses, as well as disruption to public services and infrastructure. And those could range from roads to water treatment centers. But we've talked a bit about some of that. These things have impacts on health as well. So we see how everything's sort of interdependent. On the right there is a pretty common chart that I see in a lot of different places. I think this is tallying up FEMA data, but it's estimating deaths and billion-dollar losses from extreme events in the United States. And you can see how many of those are actually severe storm and flood related. So tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, even windstorms, lightning, winter storms. If you tallied all those up, you'd see that that was a pretty tremendous number of the billion-dollar losses in the United States. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategies as we turn over into it. Why don't you all just give some thought to adaptation strategies that may be able to reduce the negative impacts to your community. So that's what this course is about, right? We talk through the impacts. The rest of the course after today, we're going to be focused on taking action. So studying how do we know what we're vulnerable to and how do we act on it? How do we address the vulnerabilities? So you already are probably doing things within your community if you're accustomed to floods that is trying to mitigate some of the damages. So throw in the question box here some of the ideas you have for reducing negative impacts.
Lori,
Yep.
sorry, Lori has a response already. She says, this may be too big, but creating a stronger native healthcare system. And she links to a New York Times article. Lori, if you could email us that article, we can make it available for everybody. But you know what? If we're going to talk about this, we might as well talk big.
These are a few suggestions that, these are just samples. There's so many ways. And when we get into vulnerability assessments, I'm going to share with you a tool we built where we have over 130 different adaptation strategies that can be filtered by exposure and impact type. But these are just a few, just to wet your whistle and know that there are things that we could do to protect our community if we are to prepare in advance. And so things like developing policies or plans to preserve our wetlands and establish vegetative buffers along rivers and streams to reduce flooding, runoff, and erosion. And so some of its green infrastructure can help sort of boost nature in a way that helps preserve some of our lands. Restrict development in high risk or post-disaster areas to reduce losses. You could develop preventative initiatives before the next disaster to build human resilience skills. Like we said, we'll talk about that next time. Connect community members to financial resources for disaster insurance. You can consider alternative power supplies in the event of those outages, which might include things like backup power systems and even microgrids. You can seek assistance, resources, and grants, some loans from federal agencies for disaster planning, emergency management, and for distressed communities.
I have another couple of responses here that I'll talk about. Nataline Cummings says that they've recently passed ordinances that require inclusion of stormwater management during and after construction of all structures. And Nicholas Briscato says many nations do not have flood risk products from FEMA, and he works at FEMA, so he knows. Work with FEMA regional offices to develop flood risk data. This can then strengthen hazard mitigation plans so that nations can join the National Flood Insurance Program, elevate structures, and participate in buyouts. Thank you, Nicholas. If you want to send us some more information about that, please email it to Angie and me, and we'll make it available. But we're doing that here in Paula right now as we work on our hazard mitigation plan, and we're also doing some flood assessments.
That was a great point. Yeah, please do share. This is a tribe this is a Hopi reservation. So this is just an example. They've had severe drought conditions prior to 2010, and then they had in 2010 a big rainfall event with rock slides. And this is just one tribe's experience with almost $1 million in cost to repair roads, telephone lines, water and sewer systems, and they even had grave sites damaged. And so they saw their water and sewer lines brought down and flooded homes and trash carried it all around. And so this is a story more about impacts than it is about strategies, but I really like where you guys are headed with thinking about strategies. And we are going to hear a related note in a few more minutes from Jamie about how they're dealing with sea level rise, which obviously has a big relationship with with storms and flooding. And so let's move right into melting ice and sea level rise.
And real quick before we do, just the last few comments. Michelle Shaw says we should be thinking about agriculture in a different way. We should be growing crops that do well in these kinds of conditions, and we need to change when we do our planting. And then Stefan Tangent is asking, can the FEMA guy explain or expand on how tribes can work with FEMA? we will get those resources for you and make them available through our Groups IO messaging.
Okay, so not everybody is probably thinking as much about melting ice or sea level rise as they might be dealing with storms and flooding, because not everybody's right on a coast or in an area where there's permafrost. But we all are sort of impacted by it, maybe indirectly. The key climate exposure facts I want you to know is that rising temperatures are increasing ocean water mass and volume. And the way that it's increasing ocean water mass is through melting ice in places like the Arctic, but not exclusively the Arctic, where the actual mass of water is entering into the oceans where it used to hover above, and volume, meaning thermal expansion. And that's because the waters are actually becoming warmer. Warmer waters have a larger volume. And so it's those two reasons why we are seeing sea level rise. Global mean sea level rise has risen about 7 to 8 inches since 1900, and about 3 of those inches have occurred since 1993, and that's coming from the Climate Science Special Report issued in 2018. And so on the right, you can see a nice image about what causes sea level rise to change, and basically just detailing a little bit further what I just explained about the expansion of the volume of water and the mass of water running down into the ocean or off of glaciers. There are some related exposures here, so it contributes to storm surges and coastal flooding, and it triggers the following secondary exposures. So air quality vectors, water and food supply, and we'll talk a little bit more about all of that. And so the regions that are mainly affected here in the United States are Alaska and all of our coastal communities around the United States. You can see also on the right a chart there that's talking about the change in sea level rise in feet over time through projections through 2100, and you can see a pretty, this gives you a visualization of how quickly things are changing from how they were before. And so from 1900 you start seeing a gradual increase up to 2100, things getting more severe, and these are based on different emission scenarios. And so as we transition over into thinking about health impacts, I invite you to share in the question box what health impacts you might anticipate. And so this one will be a relatively shorter one because so many of the impacts of melting ice and sea level rise are shared with storms and flooding. And so you can basically translate, if we know that a community is going to be inundated with sea level rise, that they will also have the same impacts that we just talked about with flooding. But in addition to that, there are some special impacts to think about for the communities that are experiencing, say, melting ice. So melting ice is happening for us and mainly in communities in Alaska, and we're seeing melting, thinning, and thawing ice-related injuries. Those are usually associated with the folks that are hunting and fishing and might find themselves in less safe conditions than maybe traditionally they were used to. So traditional hunting and fishing practices may be disrupted as a result of unsafe conditions. I'm aware of a tribe that has one of the Climate Ready Tribes grants that we have that's actually giving devices to some of their hunters while they go out to do some of their hunting practices on permafrost because they're concerned about injuries while they're out there because of the unsafe conditions. And so it's a device, a geographical device, so that they can find people if they have to find people that have been hurt. Interesting. Lack of nutritional abundance due to the loss of safe hunting, fishing, and herding practices. Mental health impacts associated with post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, and grief. And also, I don't know, this might be too much for us today, but just prehistoric diseases that may be unearthed from some of these glaciers that are now melting down. Some of the population sensitivity and adaptive capacity factors to consider include proximity to the coast, ice, and permafrost. So like I said, it's a little bit more of an abbreviated section here because we've gone over so many of the related examples already under flooding. But here I do want to talk more about displacement and destruction of historical cultural sites and assets. When it comes to sea level rise, we're seeing an inundation obviously on the coast, so anything coastal may be at risk. Some tribes are completely within a sea level rise projected area. So all of their assets, considered cultural or not, would be at risk. All of their homes could potentially be at risk, and maybe forcing folks to start thinking about displacement. There are communities, a lot of communities in the in Alaska, as well as the southern eastern area of the United States, that are already making those kinds of hard decisions. And as we'll see today, in Washington, we're starting to have those conversations as well.
So we've got a couple of things coming up in the question box. Let's see, Aaron Show, I know I'm getting that wrong, I apologize. Talks about changing availability of water throughout the year. Less water in the summer thanks to less glacial runoff. Sunny Tadlock sent us what looks like a great link for the Washington Coastal Network. Awesome resource for people in Washington State. It also covers other coastal hazards affecting communities. So again, if you could send us that via email, Sunny, send it to Angie and me. We can make sure we send it out to the whole group. Thank you.
Thank you. Some specific impacts to the natural environment associated with melting ice and sea level rise, along with the flooding impacts we already talked about, would include habitat fragmentation and saltwater intrusion. Habitat fragmentation would mean that you disrupt the connectivity of your habitats so that there's less ability to for wildlife species to migrate as they normally would. And so you might see that in permafrost areas where there is melting occurring and animals are trapped or unable to migrate. Built environment impacts, coastal erosion would lead to damaged homes and businesses. Permafrost thawing is doing the same thing. Same kinds of things, disruptions to public services and infrastructure, and disruptions to agricultural practices. I would say there are some strategies to deal with these things. I would rather actually hear directly from our guest. And so Jamie is a planner with Shoalwater Bay Indian Tribe in Tokeland, Washington. I was connected with Jamie through Cynthia Tope, who's one of our trainees, and Jamie is working directly on some issues related to sea level rise for her reservation. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about her experience in that with that tribe and what kinds of choices they're having to make. And so, Jamie, thank you so much for being with us. And if you're muted, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I just unmuted you, so go for it.
Gotcha. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, we're on the coast of Washington. I don't know if I can share my screen at all. Am I able to do that?
I might be able to help you there, but do you see something on the right there that's allowing you to share your screen?
No.
Oh, here you go. I just did it for you.
All right. All right. Do you see anything?
Yep, we see your screen.
All right. So, coast of Washington, we're the lowest reservation on the coast of Washington, about 2 hours north of Astoria. Our reservation was a half square mile originally, and that was mostly wetlands and tidelands. And so we don't have a whole lot of buildable space here. We're very small, 403 members, and only about 84 of our members live here on the reservation. And Tokeland is a small community that's out here on the peninsula, just south of us. And we separate the Tokeland Peninsula from this major highway, 105. And actually, I can totally relate with the highway being built through the middle of a reservation, because that's exactly what we've experienced here, where a lot of wetlands were created by this highway here that used to be, they were agricultural lands actually. And they're recently fixing a lot of the area so that it's not going to be wetlands anymore. So anyhow, I just wanted to point out, I relate with the mosquito issue. We have tons of mosquitoes here as well. And I think it's always been bad here though.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about the impact of sea level rise and how you guys are starting to consider your options.
Yeah, that's next. So I'm going to close that window. That's our location. Can you see this image? I have two screens, so I'm not sure which one you can see.
Just seeing a desktop.
Right. Now can you see it?
Yeah.
All right, so this is the predicted shoreline just north of us at what they refer to as Washaway Beach. This is our coastal erosion. 2004 was the red line here. And by 2053, they expect to lose that much more, blue line.
Wow.
And that green line basically is following our major highway 105. But you can see right here, the highway is beyond the green line. So it's been endangered for the last 100 years since they first built it. And we actually had to rebuild it. I believe it was in the 70s. The new highway is the 70s. But they're building constant jetty rock, levees out there trying to protect it. This line right here denotes an engineered system that is supposed to protect that highway right here at the most edge. And let's see what's next here. And then we have a berm that has been built out on the ocean by the Army Corps of Engineers to help protect our reservation. If you look at this picture, this hillside out here in the distance, that's the highway that I was just pointing out that's being endangered by the erosion. And the constant storms have caused the berm to actually erode horribly. And we lost 80 feet of it during one storm last winter. And this is just showing, they had the sand berm and it's just being eaten away constantly. And they've gone out and added a rock edge over here because that was the weakest point. So that's a lot of what we've been doing. And then this one's probably the most interesting to you. The Tokeland community, we're threatened by tsunami and sea level rise. So we are building a 2-story, 400-person vertical evacuation tower on the peninsula out here to help preserve life. Sorry about that. So those are just a few things, but the biggest action that we are taking, you can go ahead and stop sharing my screen if you want. The biggest action that we're going to be taking is trying to relocate our whole community up outside of the tsunami zone. And that's going to be a huge task. Every reservation has been located along the coast in the tsunami and sea level rise area. And because traditionally our villages were located right on the shore, but we picked up our villages and moved them seasonally. So it wasn't meant to be a static location for our reservations. So because we are, within these borders, we have to try to mitigate a static location. So we've been purchasing land uphill and in a safe location. And we've been building policies around how we can develop the new community that would mitigate stormwater surge, stormwater flow. We do have a lot of rainfall here. And recently, it was in 2007, we had a very strong I want to say winds got up to 130 miles per hour here on the coast, and we were without power for 10 to 13 days. And both highways were cut off, tree falls on both sides. So food couldn't come in or out. We realized we were a food desert. You know, we had to have things shipped in if we needed, you know, sustenance. And so we have a lot of generators because we do experience a lot of power outages. We're also on the border of 2 counties, and we're in Pacific County, but Grays Harbor County are the PUD district that serve us. So they come in, our power comes in on that highway that's also being endangered. So that highway goes, most likely our power goes. So we've been trying to work on getting power from both sides or creating our own source of power here to help sustain our people and just be self-sustained. Let's see. Some observations by tribal members. My Uncle Tom always talks about going out onto our beaches here, and they were beautiful sandy beaches you could walk on. And now, since I've moved here, even when I was a teenager, it's always been a rock jetty, and you have to climb over these giant rocks to get down to it, and it's mucky. You can sink in the mud. He said that he felt like the sea level rise could have something to do with it, the erosion, the possible way that the water is coming up towards our reservation into the Willapa Bay, because we're right on the edge of the corner that meets ocean to bay. And we just have experienced huge amounts of change. We used to be able to walk out there, now we can't. We have to climb over a lot of rock and muddy clay that is dangerous, actually. So that's just something that some of our elders have observed over the years. And then also the fishing industry, we have been inundated in the Willapa Bay by ghost shrimp, which, you know, what's going on with their predators? That's the big question I like to ask. They're taking over our oyster beds, and the oyster farmers are having a really difficult time trying to continue their work because the oysters can't survive in the muck that's created by the ghost shrimp. And typically the ghost shrimp were not this bad. Salmon are their predators, and so are the green sturgeon, and they're not surviving as much as they used to. So we need to figure out how we can help that situation, you know, higher acid levels and things like that. We're constantly studying crab shell to see how those are forming, and so those are just a few things. And the anxiety levels, you talked about the behavioral health and just those factors, knowing that we're in a zone that could be underwater if the big one hits, the big earthquake that we're supposed to expect. There's a level of anxiety there, and we just want to make sure that our people are safe and that we have a future here. And it's just good to plan for those things. We have a big task ahead of us. I think I hit on every point that I was going to, so.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That's certainly compelling and making it very real for a lot of folks. I wonder 2 things, if you would mind if you share your email address, if people have a similar situation, they may want to reach out to you for questions.
Sure.
I did see one question come through. One question was about whether or not how you are buying land. Is it through a land trust or something else?
No, we've been doing it on our own.
And Lori had another question, Lori Montserrat, about generators. Are you using solar generators or something else? How do you deal with the health and safety risks from generators?
They're diesel generators, unfortunately. And that's part of our plan, actually. We want to create the greenest community that we can when we rebuild, because right now we're just handling things as we can and trying to do as good of an environmental action as we can with each blow.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much. I wish we had a whole hour for more questions and answers, but I'm sorry for what you all are dealing with there, and I wish you the best of luck with all of your adaptation strategies. It sounds like you guys are well on your way of protecting yourselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And next time we do need to hear some guitar songs.
I'm still learning. You don't want to hear it yet.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and move on. We have the last 15 minutes we're going to spend mainly on drought. And so that'll be our final exposure for the day. We're going to go through a similar structure here. So we'll talk first about climate exposure facts. So for tribes, this is one of the biggest risk areas if you're in an area where drought is actually prevalent. Recent drought or water deficits have reached record in intensity in parts of the country. So this is not an area that every part of the country is dealing with. We typically think about the Southwest and the Great Plains as having the most severe impacts of drought. There's strong evidence that climate change increases also not just the changes to the meteorological conditions around precipitation, but also increases evapotranspiration and soil moisture deficits. So this is sort of working in conjunction with some of the heat increases to change soil moisture. And so on the right, some of you may be familiar with a website called Drought.gov. It's a US drought monitor. And so this is I just looked at this today. So this is a snapshot of what they're showing for today. It's a drought outlook through May for the entire country. And you can see where drought is expected to persist, which is brown, where it is expected to remain but improve, which is gray, drought removal likely, which would be a green area, and a drought development likely, which would be the yellow areas. So as we're moving towards spring and summertime, these are the areas that this drought monitor anticipates to have somewhat of a drought outlook for that period of time. But this is just a short period of time, and in climate change, work and vulnerability systems, we don't look typically at this small of a period of time. So down below, you see a chart that's talking about, this is for the South Interior region in California. It's coming from the California Climate Assessment, and it's showing precipitation for 12-month periods ending in December. And really what you see there is variation, but also a general trend line downward from 1990 to 2010. Tricky part about drought is that it happens in these, for months period at a time, it happens in these episodic fashion, and then it may go back to normal for a period of time. But overall, the research is telling us that the trend will be increased in terms of drought, both in duration and in frequency. But like I said before, there's this intersection with storms and flooding where more severe extreme precipitation days will occur in the meantime where there is drought conditions. And so you may have a period of drought, and then you may have some extreme storms. Those two things don't really cancel each other out in terms of impacts. They actually, in some ways, work against each other, where you have an inundation of extreme precipitation happening in a drought-prone area or an area that has recently experienced a drought. You will see an increase in flooding because there's a potentially a less capacity to absorb some of the flood waters. So as we move along here, I'm sure some of you are already anticipating health impacts of drought. This one's a little bit trickier, a little bit less obvious because this isn't really a emergency disaster like storms and flooding might be, where it's this acute event. It's a gradual event. And so Shasta, feel free to chime in whenever anybody has a health impact they're suggesting. So, a drought won't happen and then you're gonna fall into a dry patch and die. Like, that's not an impact. It's not a physical health impact. What we're thinking more of is the mental health impacts, and then we'll talk about the secondary exposures that happen as a result of drought and how those affect us. So mental health impacts, there's a lot of research actually around drought and mental health impacts. And so it could include things like anxiety, grief, and helplessness. And so people know that if drought gets very severe, that there's a potential for displacement, economic change, or economic insecurity, particularly for water-dependent industries. Say that could include things like agriculture and damage of the local environment. And so there's this sadness that occurs when we see the changes to our local landscapes and environment and species that may be affected and disrupted or leave the area completely. This is from SAMHSA, and these are what they suggest as some warning signs for emotional distress related to drought. So feelings of overwhelming anxiety, worry, trouble sleeping, depression-like symptoms, disputes, health concerns related to dust, low water flow, or poor water and air quality, and financial concerns.
So we have a response from Seven who says lower groundwater levels impact water sources for well owners, and rivers supply water for fish, and the fish are food sources for local people. So certainly. And I read something recently about somewhere in California how a family had a little boy who was so worried about the lack of water or everybody talking about drought that he started to refuse drinking water because he was so worried that there wasn't going to be enough water left for everybody. So, which kind of shows us that we got to be even more careful about what we tell our kids, because the little ones take this stuff quite literally, and it's scary.
Yes. Well, so we see some relationships with other exposures here. We know that in areas inundated by drought, the drought conditions can contribute to wildfire and also storms and flooding. Not storms, but flooding, right? So it makes a community that experiences a severe storm, the conditions are more likely for flooding. Wildfire, I think, is pretty obvious, but basically as you're seeing soil moisture dry out, you might actually see a change in fuels that are potentially more flammable, and changes in ecosystems that are more conducive to wildfire. The secondary exposures are, we'll just go through them one by one. We're going to talk a little bit in detail about each of these. Dust, allergens, and ozone. So we see there's the correlation between drought and these air quality impacts is pretty significant. Some communities deal with drought with dust as a huge air quality impact. So it's a type of a particulate matter concern. Water supply disruption, that one's obvious. That one's the biggie, right? That's what we're concerned about. Lower agriculture yields. That's one form of food insecurity, but we also heard from somebody else who's talking about their fishing industry being triggered. The lower, the research is showing a correlation with West Nile virus and drought as well. And the reason for that has to do mainly with as water systems are shrinking, you might have more stagnant areas of water where it used to maybe potentially flow more perennially or annually. Hantavirus, that's another vector-borne disease. We hear about that actually in the Southwest here, which is a rodent. It's a rodent-carrying disease. Forest infestation and disease as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about these. On the right there is showing you a historical versus more baseline or current view of depletion of groundwater maps in major US regional aquifers, and you just see some pretty significant depletion happening right there in the middle of the country. And so I've worked a little bit with some of the South Central or Central tribes in some trainings, and this is a huge area of concern for them. So possible health impacts. We mentioned some air quality impacts, and included in that are is something called valley fever. So this is a chart on the right here is valley fever, areas endemic for valley fever. And so you can see a majority of folks that are being affected are in the Southwest there. And it appears, so that what the research is telling us is that the fungus appears to grow best in soil after a heavy rainfall. and becomes airborne most effectively during hot, dry conditions. And so it's actually a fungus. It was found in south central Washington, far north of where it's previously known to exist. So we're seeing more extreme conditions that are leading to increases in this fungal airborne disease and a bigger distribution area. The health and climate assessment also says that drought conditions they also tend to trigger, air quality and exacerbate respiratory illness by way of several mechanisms associated with soil drying, loss of vegetation, airborne particulate matter, and the creation of conditions conducive for dust storms and wildfires. Air pollutants such as soluble trace gases and particulates remain suspended in the air when there's a lack of precipitation. So that just means without rain, you're seeing more suspended particulate matter and potential contaminants. Back to vector-borne disease, we talked a little bit about West Nile. So same kind of idea, the changes to the breeding patterns of mosquitoes and just changes to these which like to congregate around water sources. As we see water sources dwindling, in some cases we see more stagnation and mosquitoes can proliferate. I don't know that I have to say too much about drinking water supply interruption. It seems fairly obvious that the water sources would be depleted, especially for tribes that are often completely dependent on their own water supply systems, their own domestic water systems, groundwater, wells. And so this is oftentimes in the Southwest, maybe the #1 concern of the folks when I go to talk to, community members in a workshop. Some vulnerable populations here, so children and elders, communities in general that are reliant on groundwater for drinking water, and that's a lot of tribes. Agricultural workers who may be experiencing more respiratory problems due to the dried out soils, people susceptible to health impacts from poor air quality, people with mental, behavioral, and cognitive disorders, and electricity dependent populations. So some of the vulnerable populations. And then what I look for in a vulnerability assessment to moderate that risk level is the population size of the vulnerable individuals, the food environment index. So basically, what does the food environment look like today? How many people are food insecure, and where is the food coming from? So we see in the short run, maybe people that are more tied into a global food market might have an increased ability to adapt to a drought because they're not solely reliant upon their local crops or fish. But as drought becomes more severe in major food growing areas around the world, we'll see conditions changing in the affordability and access to food in general. Proximity to transit and size of a water system. So this is a big one to assess, is for your own adaptive capacity. Is your tribe currently storing water? And also to look at things like your water treaty rights and just what's been negotiated in the past, and is there any reason to kind of relook at some of that?
So we've got T-1 minute before we reach 11:30, and I see some people are dropping off, but if you can stick with us to just get through our conclusion here, we appreciate you hanging on.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's just actually wrap up. So I can you'll see this slides. There are some strategies there that we didn't have a chance to go through in terms of drought. But we do want to send you out I know it's a busy time, so we're not going to go through suggested actions, but suggested readings. Since we're transitioning next time over to the vulnerability assessment phase, so we're going to get out from under impacts, and we're going to think through from all of these impacts we just talked about, how can we assess how much risk our community is in specifically, and then we move into adaptation planning. So the next session will be April 21st, 2020, same time, and we'll go through the first part of vulnerability assessments. That's when we'll have our speaker. It will be next time as well on psychosocial resilience. And we have a suggested reading from the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, and it's the semi-recently released Tribal Climate Change Guidebook. And I'm only asking you to look at pages 36 to 38, so it's just 3 pages, pretty quick, and it will that touches upon and kind of prepares you for the conversation on vulnerability assessments. So that's just some of their suggestions around how to do vulnerability assessments, and it's actually focused, that part specifically focuses on community engagement, which will be a topic we'll be talking about the next time. Okay, well, I want to say thank you so much for sticking with us and being with us today. We had actually a pretty good turnout. I hope all of you do well as we continue through the current crisis, and feel free to reach out to us anytime. We'll be following up with these materials after the webinar today.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and stay safe, and look forward to hearing from you on our Groups.io email chats.